All right, we are back with another banger of a session. The Void Boys at it again, aka Dos Zekis. For those who don't know, a Zeki it's like a Trekkie, but Zizek.
Jacques,
A
yeah.
fan of Zizek.
Yeah.
AKA Deluche and Guaptari.
Wow, Tari. Look,
And
it's like the most interesting man though, right? It's like, I don't always choose theory, but when I do, it's Dos Equis.
exactly. That should be the slogan of the podcast, the channel, whatever we want to call it. I think we just came up with it in this moment. Andrew did, of course. I don't always choose theory, but when I do, it's those Zekis. So, what are we talking about today, Andrew? Which chapter of
We are on
me?
chapter 15, seminar 1, immortal Freudian technique over here. But we're going over the nucleus of oppression. Finally, we get to the nucleus of oppression, which I think you were saying a while ago that now it makes you kind of think retroactively from the beginning when we started this, the nucleus of like the ideational mass.
Right. The pathogenic nucleus,
The pathogenic
ideational mass. In simple terms, we're talking about the ego. So we're kind of back where we started. We took this very long and winding path around the imaginary via the optical schema, many iterations of the optical schema. And now we're back where we started. Lacan never loses sight of his original purpose, as meandering as he can be. What we were struggling with at the start of the seminar is the question of what the ego is, how we should treat it, and how it's related to repression. So we defined transference, we defined resistance, we took a look at the imaginary, we outlined different forms of the optical schema. Finally, we got to the symbolic, and here we are once again at the nucleus of repression.
All right. So already right here, we get reference of, was it O and virtual O and apostrophe O. I think like one thing about this is it seems, and I know we were mentioning this earlier, like something about this, not only just like bringing into question subject, but desire and integrating, if we could integrate desire, right? And like, what is desire? Well, it's something, it's obviously desire is the desire of the other, right? But we have to name that. And since now we're getting into desire, we're slowly getting into the function of the symbolic and how this could even tie into O and O. Because if I'm not mistaken, like one is the real object, the other one is a virtual object, right? And even though early, like in a couple sessions ago, or was it the last session? It was the virtual object and the real object in a sense. So it's like this virtual object is supposed to be the ego ideal, but it's like the ego ideal has this parallel to the symbolic order. So it seems like now it's like we are, in a sense, tracing our steps into seeing the function now of the symbolic order, formations of desire, and the purpose and function of naming, but also of words themselves, since this is what the symbolic order is, the structure of language.
Right. And one thing that Lacan is going to point out is that the subject finds their niche within language. They aim to locate themselves within language, but language doesn't belong to the subject. The subject, in a sense, belongs to language. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a common language shared
Yes,
within a certain community.
definitely. Because this is literally the again, like it made me think it's the opposite of Chomsky Bros. It's like language does not belong to the subject because it's not acquiring language. It's already thrown in to a referential structure of language, and it's only through quote unquote development, because Lacan isn't a developmental theorist. We'll just use it nonchalantly just to kind of break it down, but through one's process and one's admission into the symbolic and going through the mirror stage, the function of speech then is what helps activate the language that was already, given to us by being thrown in. Like it's like, just to reiterate, it's like what he was saying about little Dick. He's not an idiot. He's actually a master of language, but he doesn't have speech at his disposal or the proper ways of communicating. And then how he was breaking down, forget the dude's name that he mentioned, but the linguist theory of, like, you have like the demands, like the imperative statements, you have like communication proper, and we don't get that until we are fully admitted into symbolic, which means we go through the further alienation.
Right, communication that, and I could be getting this a little bit wrong in terms of, the kind of vocab that they're using here, but like imperatives
Mm-hmm.
versus like indicatives, assumed meanings within those kind of statements. And it's like, how do we get to that point? And it would theoretically, at this stage in his thinking, have to do with our full assimilation
Yeah.
into the symbolic. I shouldn't say full because nothing's ever full or completed.
No, it is definitely not a fixed or totalized system, and that's the point. Well, I mean, we're gonna get into that, especially like with the language of wholes and stuff like that. But one thing I just wanted to add, like, is like it's not even just the fact of the language is functioning through speech as communication, but it wouldn't be Lacan if he wasn't so witty and, like, metaphorical when he says that language is a performative act of invoking or evoking or whatever. Like it's an evocative process of bringing into being the other.
Right. Yes. It's as if there's one common theme among all signifiers, it's the fact that they don't primarily refer to something in reality, but rather, yes, invoke or evoke the other, which of course is an absence. So I think it's always good to keep sight of the fact that language is made up of absences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it finds its potency, its functionality, rather than in a direct correspondence with what we see and do and feel. But I wanted to ask you before we moved on, and this is more for my benefit, but I think the viewers might get something from it too. The ego ideal, I'm kind of struggling to really understand where to locate it in terms of like uh the symbolic order, like we're saying, to be assimilated, admitted into the symbolic order means to have a kind of ego ideal. Now, we have defined it before as a virtual place or point of self-viewing, of self-apprehension. In a sense, of course, it's illusory, but I would say that it locates the individual as an object, but within the larger tableau of other objects and symbols. But also, it's tied to, we related it to ideology in the past, so it's definitely tied to our understanding of ourselves, also metaphorically, let's say, or in terms of, Zizek often will relate the ego ideal back to phallic notions, symbolically phallic notions of titles and
Yes.
garb, like
Yeah.
uniforms. So
It's status, role, or like something
status,
that
role.
provides like some type of like, and again, like you could think of like the ego ideal in the symbolic order of America, um, as far as meritocratus, and then like this whole Protestant work ethic. Like your ego ideal is a projection of how you view yourself, obviously in the eyes of the others. This we could just say this as a simplified definition of the ego ideal, but in the way like you could see it function, particularly in the US, is like, everybody believes that they work hard for their money. Everybody believes that like they're getting paid for their unique labor and their skill, when really no, it's not the case. It's You're getting paid by the standard socialized labor, theory of value and everything like that. You're only getting paid, your labor is getting taken to you in exchange for a wage. But we would like to view ourselves in this ego ideal, which is an alienation, as somebody who works hard, who's got this, work ethic that they're always trying to further and further, um, exceed, and exceed their limitations, be the best version of themselves. These are all examples of the ego ideal, but mainly it is this exteriority of oneself in relation to the other, not just others, but the other, the big other, and then retroactively brought back or reified into oneself,
So
because it has. Oh, so go ahead.
no, I just wanted to ask because I'm also right now watching um, our homie Brian Becker's series on back to the text themselves, Heidegger, and trying to wed some of those concepts to Lacan. And I'm wondering if, like, when it comes to immersion into the everydayness of the world, if the ego ideal, in a sense, is still with us, let's say apart from my own stated identifications, my own series of self definitions, which I might present to a person, an analyst, for example,
Mhm.
who wants me to talk about myself. I talk about myself in terms of these identifications, but maybe the ego ideal is a little bit different from those identifications. What do
Well,
you
I
think?
I would I would definitely, yeah, agree to an extent. It's the fact that the ego ideal, just like the ego in general, yeah, it's identifications. The egos are pretty much in the plane of the imaginary, but yet the ego ideal can't exist without the admission of the symbolic. That's like the main thing.
But when it comes to like actually existing phenomenologically in the world, when I'm not thinking about these things, when I'm not saying that I'm a cisgendered white
Mhm.
male with a strong work ethic and here are my values, think about even when I am walking down the street, I need to represent myself corporeally for myself. Does the ego ideal, you think, even play into that at that level, is what I'm saying?
So this is what leads me to think of, especially since you're saying like being like for myself, we're getting to Sartre's terms, right? Being in itself and being for itself, right? Being in itself is just going to be like in reference to like the facticity that you exist, your being, but there's obviously the self-reflective negativity. The being for itself is always one that's trying to, you know, be one's potential and doing one's projects, right? I guess you could say living in a state of freedom and authenticity. However, comma, we're not like just like, and at least like I'm not saying that Sartre thinks this, but it seems like this is like the vague notion of like how um you know content creator bros that don't actually read, that just like to mumble jargon, and just like the way that existentialism is portrayed. It's like you're just this lone individual in a world of just like, mundaneness and monotony, like almost like this absurdism, Camus style bullcrap. But it's the fact that even in being for yourself, you can't help but always be for others or be with others, as Heidegger would say. And so that leads me to my next point of the gaze, at least for Sartre. And so long as you are caught in the gaze of the other in this phenomenological experiences, your facticity of yourself, or the way you believe yourself to be, is taken outside of you in the eye of the other, in the way that they see you. They mortify your image. So therefore, you could say in a sense that something like an ego ideal exists phenomenologically in that sense, so long as it's purely imaginary, but it doesn't really, and again, if somebody watching this could correct me, but it doesn't really show the structuration and the reference of how the ego ideal came to be with in the beginning, which is through the speech, through language, through this symbolic order.
Right. That was a great explanation. Yeah. And I have to separate here structuralism from phenomenology, and remember that we're straying away from phenomenology. Even if that was our starting point, we know that Lacan's interests lie in structuralism more so than Heideggerianism, phenomenology. And sometimes I think this is where I'm getting confused. I lose that definition. I start to get like conflate the two, the structuralism with the phenomenology, and I have to understand that what we're dealing with is technique, the definition of the human psyche in structural terms, and not so much existential experience.
Yeah, facticity and immediacy.
Immediacy, right? This is that, and that is why Lacan is not presenting here an ontology.
Exactly.
But anyway, I just took advantage of some of our time here to like try to clear that up for myself, and maybe the viewers found it beneficial as well. But
Yeah.
should we dive right into
Oh yeah.
elaboration, or
Yeah.
working through? Lacan's fond of this expression, working through. He uses the English working through to refer to what happens in analysis. And you were just talking, Andrew, about going from, I guess, do we want to call this the real O to the virtual O, or real is misleading, maybe?
Yeah, like, or the real image. Yeah, the real image to the virtual image. I think that's what he was trying to get at in the previous chapter.
And I think here the I that we had in the optical schema, the real subject and the real image are collapsed, and the virtual subject and the virtual image is collapsed. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but
Yeah,
I think that's why he's presenting it in these terms for the sake of convenience.
Yeah, and definitely it's like the simplified form of the optical schema in the play of not. I don't think it was necessarily just the real image versus the virtual image. More of like, now that I'm thinking about it, although maybe it could be. I was thinking more about the play of like, because we're talking about the seesaw of desire in the last one, which this is brought up. The play of the primary and the secondary narcissisms. But it seems like the secondary or the primary narcissism wants this totality in the effect of some type of real image that was lost, but it can never get back to that.
So this would be the secondary narcissism, the O with the apostrophe.
Yeah, which is part of the ego ideal, right? It's the virtual.
Can these also stand for the ideal ego and the ego ideal to a degree?
Yes, that's what I was trying to get at. Like the ideal ego is always like somebody's like identification with, they believe who they are, but it's can never really come to terms with it because it's always alienated through the symbolic order. So goes towards this ego ideal, not just to look good in the eyes of the other, or not even just the eyes, but just to reference itself in the other in this grandiose way, but mainly because they will also have this feeling of wholeness and fulfillment that the ideal ego once had.
Right. So
And I might use a political stance with it, but like this whole thing about like, let's say like make America great again, right? You know, the MAGA thing, like America was once great, right? That was the ideal ego, but now, you know, the whole MAGA thing stands towards this ego ideal of Trump and how achieving this Trumplican campaign or like political infrastructure that Trump wants to do is going to somehow not only bring this hardworking excellence or whatever the fuck they want to identify as, but it's only just to retroactively go back to like a state of fulfillment and wholeness, you know, of what once was.
and very, very appropriate that you should mention that, because his Mar-a-Lago mansion was just raided by the FBI. So I guess America's never going to be great. Sorry, guys, we missed our window of opportunity there. Damn deep state.
The deep state.
Depth psychology state, more like it, right? All right. Only 5 corny jokes per Dos Zeki. But now I wanted to say that it's like, right. So the ego ideal and the signifiers that make it up, they aren't so much attractive in and of themselves, but in as much as they kind of like contain the lure of the possibility of returning to
Yeah.
the wholeness, the imagined wholeness, the fulfillment of the ideal ego. And it's the coming and going, the comings and goings of this seesaw of desire between these two terms that should be the proper material, the focus of analysis, because we, I say we as if I'm an analysis, but an analyst, but the analyst wants the subject to be able to reintegrate their desire. But the resistance, of course, is always going to stem from the fact that the closer the subject comes to the advent of their desire as the image of their desire, in a sense, forms itself, what is provoked in the subject is anxiety. And this anxiety is a problem, but it's also productive. It's also fruitful to the degree that it indicates, it signals the presence of desire in the speech, in the form of the full speech of the analysand. And it's here that the analyst should intervene. But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of the momentum, because he's going to build to that. But what he's saying is we need to focus on the anxiety in these moments. It has to do with repression, and it has to do with desire, confrontation with the image.
Yes. And this is like right here where it's like what is being like foreshadowed with this confrontation to an image, not necessarily like the image of the imaginary or anything like that. Like rather it's like he'll say obviously in this entire like seminar, because we're like focused on the real image, but what's being encountered seems to me is the real.
The real of
Yes.
the subject. And he's going to
Yes.
say a little bit later on that the subject is what exists beyond objectification. And of course, what exists beyond objectification, I think you could define as real. And he says famously earlier in the seminar that the real is what resists symbolization absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what we're confronting when we deal with.
And just to be clear, objectification is not like something of like objectivity or like, you know, like the way philosophy would say, like, you know, analytic philosophy or like naive realism. Like this is objectively true. Now, objectification is like overall like the facts of one's identifications with themselves, but like they're all grandiose. It's all ideations. It's things that structure the subject's being, or the ego structures the ego. And I think comparing this to Seminar 11, these objectifications will then be known as the signifying network or the signifying chain of the ego.
Would you say that this is related to what you're talking about, the formation of this signifying chain, to Beihong affirmation?
No, this is more along the lines of all these resistances and things that pretty much in the sense of analysis is the fact that this is how subjects identification or the ego's identification is, how they situate themselves, but it's not necessarily a revelation, because the Biao or affirmation, because Biao Hung has to deal with the affirmation of the unconscious without any resistance or rejection or refusal of it. Pretty much the Biao Hung is going to be the unconscious proper, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I must have misunderstood the concept because that was one of the trickier chapters that we read.
Yeah, because the unconscious is affirmative. It's the denegation of Verneinung is on the level of the ego resisting.
Right. Okay. I'm thinking of then objectivation, I think is actually the word he uses. Or I don't know if I said objectification earlier, objectivation, but as like the actual generation of objects for the subject within their world, within their Umwelt,
Yeah,
in a sense.
and in a sense, for the objectification for the analytic subject is one of the way that they make facts about themselves, or quote unquote facts. Just, you know, assumptions, assertions, identifications of oneself. But what I was saying is like these aren't necessarily true,
Right.
like in the philosophical sense, or this is who like the ego is. Rather, the ego, and again, we should think of it as like the ego's méconnaissance, like a misrecognition, which is not an ignorance, but it's like a specific knowledge that leads to failure itself.
And this series of identifications that go into the construction of the ego is a process that, from the other end, could be also read as object formations, right? In a sense, in that, like, the objects of desire that make up our lives are also what we identify with. And then to relate that back to trauma, and this is just how I understand it. I'm sure there are major gaps in my explanation here, but to relate that back to trauma, it's kind of like when something is traumatic, when it's frightening, when it's anxiety provoking, when it strikes us very suddenly, it's because, in terms of our, Zizek uses this phrase, I think adopting it from Frederick Jameson, like this idea of cognitive mapping, right? It's like, and this one, I'm thinking later fantasy is going to do the work of kind of schematizing everything here, but there's a cognitive mapping that comes in that helps us locate ourselves within the wider scene that supposedly envelops us. And draws us towards certain objects and
Yes.
finds repels us away from other objects. How do we determine that? And like also, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari are going to bring up in the Kantian sense. They bring desire all the way back to Kant's understanding of desire, which is that representation is desire in a sense. It's through desire that we are able to even represent objects for ourselves. Now, of course, Kant doesn't follow that through in terms of fantasy, because fantasy still has to do with daydreaming and just whimsy. But I know this is very long-winded, but
No, I get what you're saying too, and I would
desire
say
is very much wrapped up with our direct experience of the world. I know we don't want to harp too much on immediacy and phenomenology, but I feel like maybe Heidegger and Lacan intersect here.
And one thing about like the whole cognitive mapping thing, I think that's pretty interesting, and how you tied that in with fantasy. Because what way I heard Zizek describe with fantasy is that it's so with Laplanche and Pontalis, fantasy is like the scene, right? But it is also a way for desire to learn how to desire. Like it's the scene to where desire is learning its aim, it's learning its object. That's in a sense structuring, creating a scaffolding for it, for libido to move through in this network of signifiers through language, and of course there is the imaginary aspect of fantasy because of the way of the ego creating idealizations of itself, different pictures and illustrations, or however created to the most mundane. The fact is that there is the imaginary relationship, but then there's also the structural aspect for that to hold up, and that's in a sense where the mapping of desire is going through, and it's teaching itself how to do that in the process of creating the scaffolding.
Right, and I think it's the shape of the scaffolding that we can't see, because we can't see, just to mix metaphors here, the forest for the trees, because we're focused on the objects as if they contain what we desire, but it's the scaffolding.
And it's to bring an example, it's what Zizek also says about like with cinema or film, is that it teaches us how to desire. It is a fantasy,
Right.
and through that we learn how to desire for ourselves. We're always learning, especially when it comes to like scenes of love. We're learning how to desire like aspects of love and all these phantasmatic objects, and like there's the sense of even interpassivity in there, if you want to add that in as well. So even if we don't believe it, like the duty that's put on our shoulders of believing or judging is taken away from us, and we're relieved that of those responsibilities, and it's believed for us via the symbolic.
So that's a great point, and that's something that Mikey revealed to me at some point that really like cracked my brain open, because it was like, oh right, that's why Zizek harps on cinema so much, and like why he insists on drawing from pop culture and tropes and analyzing content that other philosophers would probably deem beneath the the sharpness of the tools that they're using of inappropriate. But it's like, no, we're always learning to how to desire. We're always trying to fine tune our own ability to desire in accordance with, well, I guess certain cultural norms and mores. And what we are not able to access in the process of trying to figure out how to desire is the form of our desire, because that is like a framework that we have to be within in order to desire. To be without the framework is to experience what is happening here, this kind of later he's going to use the word kind of schism,
Yes.
is to experience anxiety, right? Because it's like, and it these moments are so evanescent, they're so fleeting that it takes a very skilled analyst to be able to home in on the exact moment when, as he puts it here, the verbal relation is related to the imaginary, where there's this sudden crisscrossing of
Oh
the
yeah.
imaginary and the verbal. And it's here that the interpretation must be given, right? And I think this is what he was building up to and showing us these other examples of interpretation that Chris and Melanie, not so much Melanie Klein, but Margaret Little, Anna Freud, he tries to explain like how where they went wrong in their interpretations and why their interpretations weren't necessarily accurate or inaccurate, but the timing is what matters, and what you say, of course, is what matters.
Yes. I think that's the main thing too. And it's like his grapple with like not necessarily like ego psychology, but within psychoanalysis, what he's critical about are just like these failures, and yeah, maybe mainly timing, but also in the fact that with object relations, it's like it comes to a point where it limits itself primarily on imaginary relations. All these things like privation, frustration, um, in even aggressivity, these are all things that rely in the ego's relation to the object, and then like the other who maybe has that object or can satisfy them like the object. That is um still that imaginary thing, especially like when he criticizes Balin on the whole genital love thing. It's still an imaginary relationship.
And that's why, the imaginary and the real can often be confused, and why.
I think mainly what he's getting at is the importance of not just the real, but with the real is we shouldn't see the real as something like of a thing in itself. Rather, it's the point of failure in the symbolic. And what he's trying to get at is that there is a symbolic order that is being ignored, even though it's like right there in their face. Like they're talking, they're using speech, but yet they're not seeing the structuration of everything that's going around. And what mainly the structure of the unconscious, and how pretty much, to bring it in 40 in terms, this is why he's always going back to Freud, is these things of sadomasochism, undermining, these all are aspects of failure in the symbolic order, because it's not, again, a fixed system. It's not totalized. It's not whole. It has lack and fragility.
That's really interesting. So, because I'm thinking of the failures in the symbolic order from more of a philosophical perspective, but sadomasochism, as you just mentioned, would be a consequence of the dysfunction inherent within the symbolic order when it
Yeah.
breaks down, when it
Yeah.
gets jammed up.
And obviously there is that imaginary aspect, which he showed in the girl that in this process of the mirror stage literally attacks the little boy, but that's because the captivation led to something like really aggressive. And you see this in like animals too, where like the animal will see, like a dog will see their image in the reflection, but there's no lure or identification. Rather, they see it as like harmful, and they'll bark. They'll bark at the mirror. Um, they'll bark at the reflection. And it's like there's this very similar thing, except the animal is jam machine, and caught up in lures. It's never held onto it for too long, but it's for us. There is this sexual investment, and it could lead to a mirroring, and then thus the primary narcissism, and then into the admission to the symbolic, the secondary alienation, or to these instances of like not fully being, mirrored, and this aspect of a sort of masochism.
What's
But
fascinating, yeah,
and in this way of kind of, because there is a trauma to this, right? And we're talking about trauma and repression in some ways, and this will probably lead us to imprinting pragung, right? There is a way to cope with that. Look at, for example, Fort Da, and this act of the sadomasochism of the reel, of the silk reel, and tossing it and then bringing it back, saying Fort Da. It's in a sense a repetition of a sadomasochist act of remapping and replaying the image of separation from the mother and the mother leaving, and in this process of harming oneself, trying to master the scene.
because you're trying to also strike at the core of the other that is
Yeah.
you, so you have no choice but to direct the aggression against yourself. And I think there's another aspect of it that's really fascinating that I was thinking about earlier this week, about how when he's discussing both the case of the wolf child with what was it, Lafort, right? Was that her
Mhm.
name?
Yeah, Lafort, Rosine Lafort.
Rosine Lafort, and the case of Little Dick and Melanie Klein, there is this concentration on container and contained. And Lacan is always going on about form, being a structuralist. And it's like with this mirroring process, this miming
Yeah.
of the image in the mirror, it isn't just to like fuse yourself with that image. I feel like that's not the ultimate aim, but to almost like literally assume the pure form of what is being reflected back to you. And the first thing that comes to mind is a like pretty gruesome example, but if I think about like Silence of the Lambs or like Buffalo Bill, it's like
Yeah.
wearing the skin of your victims. It's like somehow the most imaginary and yet symbolic act that you could really do is reduce someone to pure surface and then like
Yeah.
assume that.
And to them, they're like, I mean, there is definitely that sadomasochist aspect in him, and like, serial killer thing. But that is actually could lead to a different clinical structure of the perversion, though, which is something that's like where not only you're saying like you're not just reducing somebody to like their skin and stuff like that, but you're actually what somebody in the structure of perversion is doing is identifying the law and like taking the law in their own hands, and the law being like the law of the name of the father, in a sense, this tyrannical force. Which, yeah, I was talking with Dangerous Maybe about that. So he had a hard time trying to like. He gave me a good explanation, but he's like, yeah, I'm still confused on that. No.
The law and perversion,
Yeah.
right? Because then we're getting into Sod avec
Yeah. Convex Sod.
or Kant avec Sod, yeah. And that's, yeah, I know that's a tricky one. So maybe we should just dive back into the text. I feel like I took us down some blind alleys, no
No,
balance,
it's good. It's good.
but this is the way we get at
Yeah.
the meat of the subject. And I hope that one day we'll have some more commenters, posters who can help us to understand things, or also point out where we might not. It's not a question of being wrong necessarily, but like where we might be
At our limits.
dealing with at our limits, yeah, dealing with some gaps ourselves. So we would really appreciate that. But from wolf child to wolf man,
Yes.
boys
Yep.
to men, we are I don't know what he's talking about. I guess there's a priest here, and he was.
Oh yeah, Father Bernard.
Um,
Yeah, I don't know if Father Bernard. I gotta look him up, but I think he was a good friend of Lacan and maybe a mentor, who's somebody who was also into psychoanalysis.
and he had presented a reading of the Wolfman or something. I know it's
Yes.
not in this volume, but
No, it's
referring
definitely
to maybe another seminar that was given at some point, and this Father Bernard's
yeah.
commentary on it, perhaps. But anyway, we're back to the well, not back to the Wolfman. I think it's the first mention, not the first mention, but like the first real exploration of the Wolfman. And I feel like the Wolfman is often the emblematic example used to describe the exact function and structure of trauma.
Trauma and just infantile neuroses in general.
Right. And he says something interesting, how infantile neurosis is an attempt to do what a psychoanalysis would do, which is to reintegrate
Yeah.
desire in a sense. For the Wolfman, his traumatic experience was seeing his parents copulating in an
Turgo.
ergo position. You can Google that. Um, it goes under other names. Think Snoop Dogg's first album,
Was Turgo.
Turgo. That was one of the names. I think he was shopping around, but he thought it would be too obscure.
Snoop Turgo.
That's kind of a sick name, actually, Snoop and Turk.
And that's a good play on words, because what's his name? The Wolfman was snooping around and then saw his parents doing doggy style.
Snooping around. Honestly, the Wolfman was more of a dog than a wolf.
Yeah.
That's what they say about him. But this is tricky. It's confusing in that, like, it's not simply the scene that he witnessed
Mhm.
that is of importance, but how it is reconstructed, almost, reconstructed a second time. But I'm gonna ask you to explain this because you're much more clear and succinct
Yeah,
than I am.
and right here, right, he's trying to calculate the date of like year of how old he would have been to experience this. And what was your question about, like,
I'm just
whether or
thinking,
not
why? Why does
Lacan? Yeah, because your question was like if like Lacan was going into like a field of developmentalism, even though he's against developmentalism. What I think is important about this is like, was he pretty much, was his subjectivity able to create that into memory in which it was forgotten? And if so, like at what age was he? And maybe this is not necessarily like a universal thing, although it could be, but like for him to have already, been mirrored, had in a sense of primary narcissism. And what it made me think is not the fact of like development, but the fact of, especially in objects relations, right? I think some do take primary and secondary narcissism to be true, while others deny of a primary narcissism to begin with. You know, uh, rather it's just like, the narcissism of desiring the object. However, what I'm trying to say is the fact that if we take that maybe he was already in his stage of primary narcissism, he already went through the lure. He has this relation towards mommy me, or the object of of desire and satisfaction, right? Having his primary needs taken care of. Um, Although who knows, because he did come from a kind of bourgeois family, so it was like more of him and his what was it, his governess, not Nania or whatever, who kind of took care of him more, so he had more of that. But I think maybe as the age he was, he probably had a better relationship with his mother rather than the governess. And obviously, he was around his sister, so there's a lot of altercations with that. However, if my theory holds up, or my interpretation, he had this, relation with the mother as primary caregiver, primary satisfaction. And then seeing the Atergo, it's like there is this satisfaction that I cannot give that the father has, kind of like I don't have the phallus, there's something that the mother desires that's not me. Therefore, there is this kind of rupture in which the Oedipus complex takes hold.
And he's going to describe just how decisive the sort of, let's say, processing plant of the Oedipus complex really is. But do you think that he has this fixation on the date because he's trying to determine the facticity of what happened, or you're saying it's too located at the stage of primary narcissism in order to situate it symbolically?
Yes.
Right?
That second one. Not necessarily like to get an accuracy of the date, because then there wouldn't really be analysis, because it's not necessarily the accuracy of what actually happened, but an interpretation that suits right for the analyzan, which you would know if it works or not, because he then says in this lecture about something of lying that the analysan can do.
Which is going to be very important in a few pages, the act of lying. The Wolfman was born on Christmas Day, which Lacan is saying is not unimportant in his development. But that's one of Lacan's possible.
And listening to
misleading sort of red herrings, I feel like, almost.
Listening to Vanishing Unconscious, like breakdown of the case study from Freud, is like there is actually an important thing that Freud talks about in the fact that, like, when he brings up like the history of the subject, that he was born on Christmas Day, so he threw a fit when it was his birthday and he only received like one present and not a present for both Christmas and for his birthday. And I think this is like solely happens like right after he goes on like some weird like vacation with the governess with Nania, and then he comes back and he's like different.
You're not going to get one buy on me. You owe me 2 gifts.
We're
covering 2 occasions here. So this is where Lacan brings in this really useful concept here of the Tragung, striking a coin. He means like minting a coin.
So it's like the imprinting of the face on the coin. So like again, like Tragung means imprinting. So like the imprinting to memory, or in the like imprinting of memory of a given event, specifically of trauma.
What he says here is interesting, though, that it's located in a non-repressed unconscious. And I think if I remember my Chiesa correctly, he discusses how there's something also like a proto unconscious that predates even the unconscious formed through repression.
I mean, I would say, so long as you're like in this, I guess a libidinal investment. I'm not going to use the word stage, I mean, we're still talking about like Freud in his days before we call like late Freud, which is beyond the pleasure principle. Maybe like not so much early, but like middle Freud, but like the use of libido stages in development. If there's like the point of like the development of the primary narcissism, there's still like not necessarily unconscious, which has repression at its hand, because the repression happens from mechanisms through the unconscious that's structured like a language. What we have is maybe an unconscious that is not repressed, but it's not like you have an ego that has speech at mediation.
But as long as there's a demand, there is something like the unconscious.
Yeah. I think overall, libido is unconscious. It's not like we could be conscious of libido, right? But then, this is also going to get brought up towards the end with id, right? Where id was, ego will be.
But the formation of the unconscious proper is a consequence of language.
Yes. The unconscious that has repression, repressive mechanisms.
So this imprinting, as he says here, tried to highlight it, there we go, has not been integrated into the verbalized system of the subject. It makes me think of this concept that Zupancic talks about, the missing signifier.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what exactly she means by it, but
or it's actually, not just the missing signifier, but the vanishing mediator of Zizek. I actually, that's not something that I came up with. That's like, I got to give it to our boy Hook. He's the one who was saying that. I was listening to, I think it was one of his videos on foreclosure where he brings that up, because he does talk about repression. And
nice.
yeah.
So the vanishing mediator is something that almost like catalyzes a relationship between two parts, two elements, two integers, but vanishes. It's like it's an intermediary that is gone as soon as it appears, and you're not aware of it, but you are aware of it in absentia, in its absence, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like here we have the dialectic
Yeah.
at its most classic.
Yeah, we're dialectic bros.
We simp for the dialectic. Yeah. We don't simp for any one thinker, but we do simp for the dialectic.
Dialectical with a K, kind of like mystical with a K.
The man right here. The wolf man right here.
Yep.
So what's interesting about this is that he says, this is something that is not at the disposal of the subject's apprehension. It's not within their control, whatever this imprinted memory is. I call it a memory. It's not something they can necessarily on their own trace, but it is, well, more than suggested, it is indicated by their full speech, by the language that they use. And it's almost as if it's in the margins of the words being used in analysis that the analyst has to locate the place of this kind of vanishing mediator, or this missing signifier.
And then right here we talk about the Oedipal development. What he brings up, sadomasochism. I think I have it on my thing. This is page 190, correct? So like when he talks about repression, but the main thing is like his development of his sexual understanding of himself comes from the seduction by his older sister, who his older sister used to torment him. She was like menacing, so always pick on him, degrade him, make him feel like crap. But then there was like a scene where like, I don't know if they were bathing, like showering together or what when they were really young, but she like, I guess flashes her genitals at him and like I think even tries to touch his penis at one point. But these sequence of events then spawns the recognition of his own sexuality, to where then he starts to have this seductive act towards Nanya. Like that's why he becomes more attached to Nanya. Nadia becomes like his sexual object of satisfaction, or not satisfaction, but a sexual object where he's trying to pursue satisfaction.
So that event triggers the reemergence of this other memory then?
I think so. I don't know necessarily if it's the memory itself. It could, yeah. Or like yeah, maybe. Because
It's lit
then
at any rate.
yeah, and then I just know like I think the Oedipal development does happen when, because he does go like on a vacation with her and then comes back and he starts acting different. And I think the mom doesn't like it. So she blames it on the governess and then fires Nanya. So it's like the object of his desire he never reaches because of the demands of the superego and its prohibition. Thus, that object was taken away from him. Also has an effect on his Oedipal development.
But what concerns us primarily here is the reconstruction of this scene with Freud, right? As the kind of like matrix from which all of these different sexual dynamics emanate.
Yeah, and like if what I was saying earlier about the interpretation of the Turgo scene was like not the fact that he witnessed, his parents literally clapping, like, because I mean almost everybody, whether or not like they want to admit it, like, you're young, you freaking walking on your parents, you're like, what the fuck did I just see? I mean, it was nasty, but I wouldn't say it's traumatizing to the point where you develop infantile neuroses. But I think what happened for him particularly is the fact of more that the object of his desire wasn't also desiring him as the object as well, and that it could be taken away by someone whose desire cannot be met, in terms he can't be greater or equal. So therefore there's that, imprinting.
The other aspect that is instrumental here is the retroactivity, or like noctragly.
Yes. Natraglikite.
Like, so everything that we're describing, and I don't know if, like if I were a screenwriter, I wouldn't be doing a very good job of relating it directly to the plot points that you're plotting right now, but it's as if, this scene only gains meaning for him retroactively. It might have been shocking, but it's only properly traumatic when he is attempting to understand the object of his desire, relate to the object of his desire, and this becomes a reference point for him, this scene he witnessed. But is that the case only through the reconstruction while he's lying on the couch with Freud, or had he always made this? Had this connection always been?
I would say that with the triglycite, especially if there is this sense of infantile neuroses, like it's going to try to reconstruct, but it never really comes to doing that successfully. So then the point of analysis is to be able to reconstruct by the working through.
But the memory of witnessing his parents having sex, had he forgotten that?
I would say, I think he did, because then we get into talking about repression and the forgetting, which he'll say there's no such thing as true successful repression, because if repression is returned to the repressed, it's because what is returning is what was unsuccessful. And if it's forgotten, it will definitely come back up in other forms. It'll return in other forms. the drive to repeat.
Right, and I would think it's almost like the specific inflection of a subject's desire has to do with what's repressed
Yeah.
and the reconstruction of it. Again, we don't need to adhere to any standard of facticity
Mhm.
in the reconstruction, but the reconstruction of it gives it a site
Yeah.
through which it can be, or upon which it can be not better understood, but the through which, like, upon which integration maybe can take place
Yeah.
of the desire. But I wanted to read in Lacan's words how he's defining trauma vis-a-vis repression. He says the trauma, insofar as it has a repressing action, intervenes after the fact, après coup, not trogli. At this specific moment, something of the subjects becomes detached in the very symbolic world that he is engaged in integrating. From then on, it will no longer be something belonging to the subject. The subject will no longer speak it, will no longer integrate it. Nevertheless, it will remain there, somewhere spoken, if one can put it this way, by something the subject does not control. And you know what this makes me think of, Andrew, and you can tell me if it's appropriate or not to this discussion, but the lost object.
Yeah. I would agree.
Just the image of detachment in the symbolic world. And like what gets the symbolic going is, oh shit, there's something missing here.
Yeah.
I recognize this, I see this, and it's this sense of, oh, I guess there's always already of it, but the always already of understanding language, signifiers, words, objects, symbols, and it being sort of, these being harmoniously, to an extent, intertwined with each other, is somehow predicated also on one thing being missing. And that's always already as well, the one thing missing.
Always already.
So yeah.
No, I think that was good. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to limit ourselves to 3 always alreadys per session, because once you get to get too ahead of yourself with the always alreadys, too much. But should we take a break now, or do you want to keep going and take a break?
Yeah, we can take like a 5-minute break.
I wanted to ask you, aren't you amazed that the return of the repressed and repression are the same thing? Dr. X.
Well, nothing amazes me any longer.
Well, it amazes some people. No, X tells us that as far as he's concerned, nothing amazes him anymore.
He's Professor X. He already knew that.
Professor X, right? You didn't know that he was present for the seminars.
Exactly.
He's Professor X, and he is jaded and world weary and not amazed.
He's assembling the freaking first class right now.
I just love this little exchange. And then I don't think you hear from Dr. X again.
No.
I know there's Dr. Z, there's Dr. X. He probably just didn't want his name given, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that, or like maybe like we don't know who he is really. Like you don't really like hear his name being said. Because like if this was recorded like on like some tape, like you don't really hear probably too many of the names besides like Benoni or like Hippolyte. We just assume that they're all doctors of some profession, philosophy, psychoanalysis, psychology, etc.
Well, this would be some good detective work for someone.
Yeah.
Might want to find out who Dr. X is. That's homework for anyone who has a lot of time on their hands.
He's that forgotten Wu-Tang member.
Right. So Manoni, our boy Octave,
Yeah.
and Hippolyte, they're kind of
Hippolyte,
like sparring here back and
and
forth.
the you god of philosophy, Hippolyte.
That's not very nice to Hippolyte. I would say Capadonna, maybe.
Capadonna. I was gonna say more of like Jacques Malaire's the Capadonna, because like he makes his feature in Seminar 11, like he makes his feature in Triumph.
Capadonna's not on Triumph.
Yeah, he features on there.
Is he?
Yeah.
I don't remember him on Triumph.
Yeah, I'll screenshot it later. I'll show you.
Okay. We're talking about successful repression, the return of the repressed,
Yep.
forgetting,
Without
forgetting. I don't know if we want to dwell too long on Heidegger here, but it is interesting that Heidegger gets mentioned.
Yeah, and because we were talking about, right, repression is forgetting, but then there's also the forgetting of forgetfulness, but not like this clumsy, like, oh, me, I forgot. It's like something that you just don't know, because it's just like this unconscious mechanism where memory is stored, and therefore it doesn't become conscious. It takes a while for it to even manifest in dreams, and it's only through the working that what was repressed, returns. And the mention of Heidegger is also crucial, because his notion of lethe and aletheia, right? You got forgetfulness, and then, like, in a sense, aletheia, it's correspondent to truth, but only truth as something that is revealed, or there is a unconcealment, as you'll say, that something in the phenomenon is disclosed to being, is the main thing. This, and again, the revelation is the main thing, because Heidegger likes using these metaphorical terms too in this hermeneutics, but the revelation of the light of the phenomenon as it shows itself for itself.
And that's related to repression. How? I'm not repression, forgetting.
Because of the way in which, if we take the symbolic order as like parallel to the absorption into everydayness, as we're thrown into the world and we're already in the world, being in the world, then Daseins everydayness, right, is always going to be like readiness at hand. And in some instances, some occurrence could happen where things become present at hand, where then you develop concepts about stuff, develop a techne, an episteme. But through this constant going through everydayness, that you get absorbed into Das Man as well, which again will conceal being, which is being in the world, one's projects, one's authenticity, that it becomes forgetful. And it's almost like if there's also a repression or forgetfulness of being.
You forget that you are a being in the
And,
world.
and yeah, that, and then even the forgetfulness of what is meant by being in the history of ontology. And it seems like what is being disclosed or revealed is that not what being is, but the fact that the notion of being had been forgotten. So it's now coming into question what is meant by being.
Because the notion of being had been long since enfolded into categorical.
Yes. From ousia to essence and existentia, res cogitan, res existentia in Descartes, and then you got like the synthetic I in Kant, and then you get like subject object, you get spirit in Hegel, and so all these different things. And then in the sciences, right, you got the organism or the biological being. In anthropology, you got the human, all these different categories that denote to a certain being never get to the problem of what is meant by being, even, and that's why he even says in the beginning of Being in Time, like the different sciences, like, we even today we like to have a hierarchy of sciences in which we privilege on this tree of knowledge biology, especially with evolution. People are like, oh, it's just human nature, it's just biology, right? What is meant by that, though? What is this being of the biology that's being put into question? And he will even say that, and especially with anthropology as well.
I like that breakdown you gave of the history of the obfuscation of this question throughout philosophy, and I want to put a pin in that for the end of this discussion.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to go over some of those terms used. That was really interesting. But so Lacan is actually giving Heidegger some props here, but he's also eager to redirect the conversation as usual back to technique, because he doesn't really want to get lost in the weeds of philosophy so much. But he does concede that is this aletheia? No.
Yeah, that's a Lethe.
Lethe.
Forgetting. Yeah.
Forgetting.
Aletheia, yeah. Aletheia is, I think, further down below on the next page, if I'm not mistaken.
Forgetting or shadow of the truth.
Yes.
This idea that Heidegger employs does relate to his own notion of, or Freud's notion of repression and the forgetting of forgetting. So, like, how does forgetting of forgetting differ from everyday forgetting? I forgot something where the memory comes back to me, I'm reminded of it. Oh, I forgot that. But what is the sensation of forgetting you forgot?
I think forgetting that you forgot, like forgetting in the sense that it's like that you're so absorbed that not only do you forget something in particular, but also even the act of forgetting gets forgotten. Like the act of forgetfulness. Somebody who's just so absorbed in everydayness and Dasman will forget that. Like, we are so absorbed in capitalism that we forget about many, more humane things that are, not selfish or exploitative or consumerist mentality. But then even in the act of the commodity, and like we indulge in our own narcissism with late stage capitalism and in ideology, but we also forget the forgetting of that because we're stuck into this moment of, I would say, time ceases to be for a short second because we're in this like symptom of enjoyment.
Just to sort of try to find a more banal sort of definition of it, when we remember something in Dasman in the everyday sense, we also remember where we were when it happened, when it was told to us. Oh, I remember you said this to me, and I was there. Whereas if a memory that's been repressed returns to us, we don't necessarily have the wider context for it, right?
Yeah, and I would say that like as far as in the way like we use the term forgetting, like, oh, forgot my keys, like I wouldn't say even Heidegger would use that term forgetfulness or forgetting in that sense, like, oh, silly me, I forgot to order my friend coffee, like when I stopped by the coffee shop. I think that's more of like being preoccupied, like, lost in like everydayness of your mind that you forget to pay attention. I think forgetfulness to him is more of like a deep philosophical thing of literally, you know, the facticity of your existence is slips away from the mind. Not necessarily like, just like the way, like, an average person would be like, yeah, like, I forgot my wallet, or like, or I forgot, you said this the other day.
But do you think what I said has any weight here in that, like, if we're thinking about the reconstruction of this scene?
Yeah, and in that sense, yeah, and it's like you do come to a remembering of the scene, but it's not an accurate way. And I think that's why he was saying like successful, like, and like Heidegger would not be interested in the term successful forgetting or successful repression. Successful is only something that takes place for the therapist. And what is being successful is not the fact that they have some accuracy of what was forgotten or repressed, rather of an interpretation that holds weight and guides at a reconstruction of the history of the subject. Because we're not trying to get it like some authenticity of being, but rather something in a way that names desire. Because here's the thing, right? There's no meta language, so how can we be actually accurate, right? There's always going to resort to some type of metaphorization. It's just something that's able to, and think about it with the homie Brian Becker. He said that like being able to create new metaphors, right? New signifiers and the signifiers and creating new metaphors. It seems like that's what we're doing in not only naming our desire, but reconstructing the past and working through. It's a metaphorization of the past rather than a literal accuracy of the past. And you could see it in the same way, like Lacan will say, like there's a truth structure like a fiction. Like when somebody, like breaks down, describes a traumatic event that happened, or even like maybe like they got into an altercation or a fight, or like maybe they got in a car accident. All these things that stand out from like everydayness, of like mundane, normal, calm, collective frequencies of events, like these things that stand out, that rupture like peace and monotony and pleasure. When they are retold or given an account of, they're never given, line by line or by truth. There's always some type of reconstruction of metaphor, or some exacerbation of the details. The more overly detailed, not by accuracy, but by metaphor, the truer it is for the subject. Because if they could literally say what happened literally, there's no trauma. There's nothing that stands out.
I think I am getting it in terms of like historicity, right? We have these gaps, Lacan says, in our knowledge of our life's story, let's say. And it's like the thing that is important is not the fact just that there are gaps, but that we're not even aware that there are gaps.
Yes,
Because
that's you.
in everyday life, we tend to pursue, let's say, Heideggerian projects with kind of like lust for fullness and completion, and we need to keep going in order to exist under the misapprehension of completeness. And Lacan believes that the work of analysis should draw our attention not just to the location of gaps, but the fact that there are gaps where we didn't think there were. And that would be something like the forgetting of forgetting.
Yeah.
In a sense, I'm struggling with the idea, but it's definitely dialectic too, because whenever
Yes,
you have a redoubling like that, whenever it's a forgetting of forgetting, or desire the desire of the other,
Well, now that we're getting into this, it's also helpful to rethink also, I mean, ultimately, and I'm not trying to get too lost in Heideggerian philosophy, but this is the last thing I'll say because you brought up the
Go for it.
dialectic.
Yeah.
But with forgetting or the forgetting, but like lethe and aletheia, right? Forgetfulness and revelation, we have a sort of, in a sense, the minutic that comes about from Plato, especially since, like, you know, the concept of being ended at Plato and Aristotle. Like, look at the maieutic, and I always like to fall back to this, especially because this will come up in seminar too. But like, right, if all knowledge is remembering, right, remembering what was forgotten, that's Plato's whole thing of epistemology is, right, is this remembrance, and it happens through, in a sense, a similar working through, although maieutic is not the same thing as psychoanalysis, although there's a certain form that's parallel. And in the way that in the Meno, Socrates was giving these specific questions for the slave boy who only knew Greek, right? That was it. Didn't know anything else, but gave him these sort of questions with open ends to allow him to kind of come up with the answers and to remember what was already, in a sense, dormant, or what had been forgotten. It was concealed, and now it was revealed. So the kind of even forgetting of the forgetting, because he was a slave boy, right? He didn't know anything else but Greek, so he had no memory of these latent faculties of reasoning.
It's almost as if like all of the parts are available to you in a sense, and they're always with you. You're like, when you think about the metaphor of emotional baggage, this person has a lot of baggage. You're dragging this along with you,
Yeah.
all of these parts, but it's like, of course, you don't know how to assemble them. You don't even know what purpose they serve or what they are. But through the reconstruction in analysis, it's like, even then, it's like you're given a kind of scene, but there is no larger context for the scene that comes from the reconstruction of these parts, because it is the scene of your existence. It is
Exactly.
it's the scene that envelops everything you do and are. So there's nothing outside of it, in a sense, and that's the thing that's hard to conceptualize. And when they depict, analysis or therapy in movies and stuff like that, it's always like, oh, this scene is triggered in my mind, and it's like a cutaway, like what do you call it in video games, like a cut scene in
Yeah.
a video game, like, and then like, oh, I gotta watch this cut scene
Yeah.
so I can continue on. But that's how people, I think, tend to imagine what, like, the return of the repressed is. But no, it's not just this little movie that's waiting to play in your head.
Mm-mm. It's literally in the return of the repressed happens in those holes or gaps in the movie that you play in your head.
Right. We all have these movies
Yeah.
we play in our head. We all have this scene of our traumas that we play out and
Yeah.
live, but like that's not the same thing as the reconstruction of the scene.
Or like, you forget that you forget, in the sense of like the cringe memory when you're like in middle school and you like call like the teacher mommy by accident or some shit like that, and then like you're just like laying in bed trying to sleep, and all of a sudden that shit pops up and you're like, oh my god, shit was crazy.
Stop right now, because now you're gonna just welcome all sorts of unpleasant memories, just waiting in the wings, ready to bubble up.
It's like that meme of the one dude by the tree, and he's like, you know, the return of the repressed, like.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, exactly. Lurking. But yes, so we've got this taking it back to the ego, and our boy Balint might be related to this Bevan guy you've been studying.
Big Valiant, freaking.
Bevan, by the way, for those who don't know, Andrew Simpsford. Bevan,
Bevan, freaking communications, sociology, business etiquette.
Andrew's, he's a big fan. He loves
It's just gotta get rid of those unconscious biases and
those
like what's
unconscious biases.
what's triggering is that what Lacan doesn't understand is that he's just a victim of his cultural upbringing, and he's got a lot of biases that he needs to uncover. If he just would have realized that, he probably would have already broke the code.
Broke the code, and then it's just like we'll all be happy together.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I like this part because he's coming at balance on some ego psychology is bullshit shit. And it's like he's saying how, if we're trying to strengthen the ego and create this exercise of self-mastery, then of course what it's not just he's saying like this is bullshit, but he's saying like what are you even trying to do here, and what would it result in exactly? And I was saying to you before how it reminds me of this idea of like mental strength and like
Yeah.
to be like mentally strong, and some people are mentally weak and some people are mentally strong. It's like what would that even mean exactly? And he says here, it's like, what does it mean that they can tolerate a greater amount of excitation?
Yeah, like it's just like you're expanding the ego to like for what? Like what's the goal? Like, what are we trying to be, like ego the living planet or what?
Exactly. And it's like, it can be improved by
Yeah.
exercise, and it just makes me think of how metaphors of athleticism, especially in America, tend to be the most predominant. We're going to talk a little bit later about different, yeah, culturally limited, culturally delimited symbolic orders as they pertain to the subject and the individual.
Yeah.
And I fear that what I'm saying sounds like it's verging on what we were just talking about before with like unconscious cultural biases. No, very
Yeah.
different concept. But I just want to point out that something just occurred to me here where it's like part of our symbolic makeup has to do with like, yeah, I feel like athleticism, not that there's anything wrong with athleticism, but like somehow sort of poetically dominating the way we think about all other activities, whether it's like stand-up comedy or learning an instrument, or it's always just like this idea that there's a strength to it, a strengthening process. And
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there is like a painful pleasure to athleticism, but the fact that like there is this like centering of like athleticism as the pinnacle performance of not only like physical prowess, but also mental fortitude. But when you look at the reality of it, and this is not my point. My point, I wanted to get in deeper back into the whole thing about balance and the strengthening of the ego. Rather, when you look at like athletes, it's like they're the pinnacle of human excellence, and they're doing these like virtue deeds and doing these things that make their life more fulfilling because they're waking up at like 4 a.m. listening to Jocko Willink's journaling and then like doing Wim Hof or like all this like freaking rubbish, like literally. But the fact that that's centered as the most like not only like again for the pinnacle of mental health or physical health, but also mental health. It's like, well, what about like somebody who's like an academic or like again somebody who's in like a really good musician, somebody who wrote a lot of books, all these things. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. But like the main thing I wanted to say about the comment that you made about like the predominance of like athleticism and balance and ego psychology is the fact that like is mainly something that is used in the mental health community and the happy signifier community in America with behaviorism and ego psychology. One of the things that DBT, CBT bros have you do is like, they have you take homework home, like you're doing work at home. So it's like you take therapy home, like you take notes about things that you're not mindful of, things that, are unhealthy habits, things that are, always making you foreshadow events that never happen. And therefore you're getting caught in emotional triggers. But the main thing is like ways to cope with this. lift weights, go out for a run, eat healthy, to delimit stress and all these like emotional triggers, do yoga, all these things. Is a checklist of mainly privileging the physical aspect, athleticism, or some type of fitness thing. And you could do all that. And you could be a neurotic. You could do all that. And you could be a freaking Patrick Bateman. And
Yeah,
the thing
in
is
fact,
like,
the more you do, the more you might be like a Patrick Bateman, you know.
and it's like you do all this, and yet you're still freaking constantly undermining yourself in a therapy. And the CBT bro would be like, well, I mean, you're doing everything right. I have nothing else to say. I don't know what's wrong. I mean,
At that point,
yeah,
your therapist is just a life coach
yeah, exactly.
who's teaching you to be a better oiled cog in a machine, essentially.
Yes.
Or I
And,
think
and like you could like be in a analytic session with freaking Freud, say that you're a weightlifter, you're an MMA fighter, you're always waking up this early and doing this, and then you just stare at you and not say a damn thing because he doesn't care about that. That's not what he's looking at.
Well, this is what. Oh, we shouldn't mention it. Let's
What's
not.
up?
I didn't want to give away. We talked to someone recently who we admire very much, and we're hoping that our audience will be able to listen to this talk soon enough.
Yes.
But he who shall not be named, Dr. X.
Yes, he is Dr. X.
Dr. X mentioned how his analyst systematically avoided responding to his demands and how that was a difficult experience for him, but he really admired that's a kind of fortitude, the the wall that his analyst put up in response to his demands for reciprocation, which is just human, and obviously we benefit from reciprocation most times in many ways, not most times, it really depends, but the fact is, in analysis, that lack of response is what will get desire going if it is instrumentalized in the correct way.
Yes. Yeah. That was a great way to conclude it. Because that's literally what, like, if ego strengthening or weakness was the thing, that's what it would literally be, like trying to strengthen it in the way that the ego sees itself. But how does it see itself? Not through itself, but through the other.
Right. Not through itself, but through the other. So the analyst becomes a source of dependency for the ego because it is this other. But the more the ego is drawn out through the lack of satisfaction, the almost like a malnourishment of it, the more desire comes to the fore. As soon as something happens, like with Margaret Little and the patient who had the father who died in the radio broadcast, or Chris and the brains that he wants to eat, refer to past sessions if you need more context for this. We're not going to go over all the details of that, but
my boy Bad Brains.
Bad Brains. In those moments, the ego is fed and satisfied, and the work of analysis can come to a screeching halt. And it can be devastating, I think, is something that Lacan believes, or else he wouldn't go to these lengths to describe what Freud's technique consists of, at least to him. I don't know what. Well, there's many directions we could take this. There's so much here, but he's saying that the ego is an imaginary function, and you can't blind yourself to the fact that it is essentially imaginary. And this is what he was saying in the last chapter, if I'm not mistaken, about Dora, which is that if you name the subject's desire for them, then the analysis can really go awry.
Yes,
The subject
exactly.
needs to
That's a
induce
counter
it in their own
transference.
desire. That's a
That's
counter transference.
that's yeah, and that's why you don't want to do that, because then you're imposing your own master signifier onto them.
Right.
It's like in the same way, like with cult leaders will do that to like the most like fragile minds of like imposing a master signifier on them that actually fits, and they're like, well, that makes sense. Or like not even just that, but like the modern day cult leaders would be like influencers and stuff like that. The way that they, cling on to the fragile minds of simps and incels and just broken people. It's like, these Elliot Hulse motherfuckers and like all these other like, like Gary V, like they're appealing to the fragility of the psyche in, people who are products of late stage capitalism. And it clings on the way like, oh, because they're saying everything right, that makes sense. And then it's like the quilting point is because, you're not working hard enough, or you don't want to because you're always told to settle for less type thing.
And these people know that they can always exploit this kind of primary masochism that's always at work in people, because that's where they tie their signifiers to this kind of primary masochism.
That, and it's like they criticize the system and broken down of system and culture and modernity, and then they reify it by saying you got to do exactly what modernity and capitalism wants you to do.
Yeah, they'll say, because there's still this like bastardized form of capitalist hegemony and power relations, and just in the fact that they'll say, most people in society, they're just going through life without really thinking about it, but you're different, you think about your place in the world. And then exactly, they reify the exact logic of capitalism, and it becomes even more, the magnitude of it, the intensity of it is just like amplified suddenly.
The whole like Kai Lopez, bro, like I worked a 9 to 5 once, and when I got there, the owner of this restaurant made me clean tables all day long. You know what I did? I quit the next day. Never worked 9 to 5 again. Look at me now.
As if, right, the only grind, and the only like mind-numbing, soul-crushing grind in capitalism is just 9 to 5s. That as if being independently wealthy isn't in its own way maybe even more soul-crushing. But anyway, we'll get back to the topic here. I mentioned this before, and I apologize if we aren't always connecting all the different loose parts here, but it's
always already connecting.
They're all always already connected, because once you understand one signifier, you understand the entire network, or you're at least admitted into the entire network. Understanding one is predicated on an understanding of the totality of it. But
I mean, you really think we're bad with like going off topic? Look at Lacan when he's talking about like you should really read this poet right here. It would really help your understanding. He bring up some random poet like in like a couple chapters ago
that no one's ever heard of, but he likes. He was the original hipster, where he's like talking about deep cuts and B-sides, just to.
Oh, you never heard of Kill an Army? You should.
You should though. In all seriousness, do listen to Kill an Army. They're shit. But I really like this kind of, I mean, I would say it's kind of like a digression, little
with science, right?
Excursus about science, and it sort of, to me, relates back to the optical schema and the eye of science, and this idea that like scientists are trying to pin down the interactions between ideally all objects in order to understand how things work, right? And it's like his criticism of science or scientism here as I was mentioning to you before, to me is not the typical criticism in that it's like, well, you can't ever really understand how the totality of everything works. There's always going to be some kind of mystery to it. And that's God or religion or mysticism. And like science can never encroach on that space. It's like that in itself is just kind of very superficial and
It
like
always leaves the room for that.
ineffective critique of science because it still concedes most ontological ground to science, except this little margin. He's saying, no, the problem is the scientist. Who is this for? Who is all this for? For the benefit of the scientist.
Especially even with like the most atheist scientists, like look at like a Michio Kaku bro, who's like, we don't know everything, but the universe is filled with mysteries. We'll one day be able to locate that.
Right. And then you're compelled to be like, what's your investment in this, buddy? Yeah. It's we're maybe oversimplifying what he's getting at, and maybe I don't understand it entirely, but it's sort of like, yeah, he says the subject is only sustained in the end on the plane of consciousness, since the subject X in science is in fact the scientist. So the scientist also has a symbolic position here that is not to be discounted, but in some sense is directly affecting and influencing the very trajectory of the work that
and that, and like the way I think about it, and this is something that Dangerous maybe helped me like point out with understanding the thing of paranoiac knowledge, in the sense that the way discourse of like not only like Enlightenment philosophy and then like science even today, not even just prior to the structuralist, post-structuralist French thinkers, the fact of like there's just something out there that's pulling the strings and that we demand to know. That's the paranoiac knowledge, and this is something that science is guilty of.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right. And I can know it.
Yeah.
And of course sublate it.
I will know it.
I will know it.
Yeah.
And I demand to know it. I will be one with it in a sense. And therefore, but what's really, it reminds me of Zizek's whole idea from Ticklish Subject of the thing out there is me. The thing that I figure out there is me, right? Like that's the right thing.
We are the universe observing itself.
And if we are, that's a terrifying thought. That should not be a pleasant, comforting notion. It's like that thing out there that I'm trying to avoid, though. In Zizek's understanding of things, the way he elucidates it is, well, he's talking about dusting, of course, and dusting ultimately is the subject. But I don't know what all the different implications of that are, because it's all right. We're tying ourselves in knots here, but he then quotes Borromean knots, the best. Love that, the Borromini family, if that's who they're named after. He quotes here the famous dictum, "Woe es war soll ich werden," where id was there, ego must be. And he says at one point, "Are you with me?" Yeah, not really, kind of. Hopefully, I'm not gonna bother to try to link all these things together because hopefully it'll kind of take shape on its own. But there's this A, by the way, when he talks about this capital A, I believe it's supposed to be the plane mirror.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, because like like the big A, I was thinking he doesn't really say it, but I was alluding to like overall the optical schema, it seems like, in the way that he's describing it.
Right. And the optical schema still forms the backdrop of all of his explorations here, so it can't jettison it.
No.
Yet as difficult as it is. This whole chapter, this section of this chapter, the logic of it is confusing, but I think because he's circling the nucleus of repression, the ego, and he relates it, of course, to the Wolfman, the Wolfman's repression, the scene he witnessed, forgetting. And I think, yeah, it does all converge in this capital A, in that, like, we have the plane mirror. And I think the thing that, and this is, again, shout out to the homie Brian Becker, he pointed out how within the mirror, we don't just see ourselves, we also see images behind the mirror, because you can see it also as like a shop window. So it's not a perfectly reflective surface. It's also a surface that reflects the objects behind it. And these are the identifications that we get caught up in.
Yes, yes. And one thing about the forgetting of the forgetting was also, I think, now talking about it, of the optical schema, is maybe also a forgetting of this real object, or the loss of this real object, or of
Yeah.
even the would be the primal trauma, but also just the overall, like, the moment of the lure.
Right. And the real image, which of course has to do with self mastery, the primal ego, that contained dichotomy we've been dealing with the drives and the body.
Mm-hmm.
There, we don't ever apprehend the real image as a true totality, as it truly is, because it's already an illusion. And the concave mirror warps two things together that seem to achieve a kind of totality, but there are spots missing. And this is what I was saying before. To me, it's like, and this is why I think it's appropriate about to talk about the gaze, because it's like we have this anamorphosis,
Yeah.
blot. It's like that what's missing in the scene is always, in a sense, ourselves. Like, we can
Yeah.
place ourselves within the scene, but never quite perfectly. So how can we ever give shape to the ego as an image, as a perfect image? But in earlier in the seminar, he says that, what completes the image is what needs to be reintegrated into it. But then it's like, once the reintegration happens, it isn't this happy moment of the happy signifier finally coming to some kind of fruition with the healthy ego's help. It's like, no, there's an unfamiliarity, something weird, distorted, frightening, and like strange about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm just beating a dead horse here. I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, like, I will stand by this sentiment, that there is a direct relation, or not direct, but like, there is just like this connection between this seminar and seminar 11. Like, it's like a working through, and like, because you brought up anamorphosis and the gaze, but like also just lost image, object cause of desire, real image, like the lost object, everything. And he even goes back into optical schema in seminar 11 too, and just elucidates it more. So it's like there's a huge connection between this seminar and then seminar 11. So anybody who disagrees will have a phenomenological experience in everydayness of readiness to throw hands.
Readiness to throw hands. This is our like vanguard concept that we came up with, and that we're gonna contribute to Heidegger's studies.
Yeah.
Change the game. So yeah, readiness to throw hands right now. Good lead up to that. Yeah, 11. I'm gonna check out after this seminar, because I want to. Everyone says go right to 11. Maybe it's good to go from 1 to 11. I don't know.
Yeah. Spinal Tap, they said that their amps go up to 11. So
on some Spinal Tap shit. Yeah, boy. All right. So we're at 3 now. Once again, it kind of starts to fall into place here. The superego. Yes,
yeah.
finally the superego. emerges onto the scene. We all love the superego. Andrew, what do you picture the superego as? Just like any character from film, television, media? He made a meme about this once.
Oh, did I? I don't remember.
He's made so many memes at this point.
Yeah.
That
I'm forgetting now. I'm the forgetting of the forgetting now.
I think you said it was Debo, right?
Oh yeah. That's right. It is Debo.
So I want y'all to picture Debo from Friday as we unpack all this.
Exactly, and the infantile neurotic subject is red. My grandma would give me that chain.
Right. And then Chris Tucker is the id.
Chris Tucker, he's always like trying to get into a level of transgression to go back to like some type of like ideal ego.
Exactly.
You can see maybe is Debo the superego, or is it really Pops that's the superego? He's always demanding, he's always prohibiting. He's talking about he's like you're drinking up all the milk. I had to hide my grapes.
It might be because he also lays down the law, defines the law, what's lawful, and that's what we're dealing with here is censorship and kinds of schisms. It's interesting. He says that the difficult to reconcile these two schisms, but it's like if the subject is desire and desire is the schism within the symbolic order qua language, then the superego is something like the schism within the symbolic order qua law. That's how I interpreted this.
Definitely. And the law that Pops throws down is like the word of the day is job. J-O-B, job. The master signifier right there.
And he also says, right, like fight with your hands, not with not with guns.
Exactly. So in that point, like the superego actually brings out the ego ideal in that case of all that you're meant to be.
Right, because the superego is punitive, but the ego ideal is exalting.
Yeah.
Which is something that is important.
But and like the ego and with the superego, like there's never like a time, like it barges in whenever it wants, demands. It's like barging in on Craig and smoking. He's like saying, "What's up with all that damn noise? You kids sipping on that wine and smoking on them tweets."
That exactly.
What does he say? He's like, what's that? Big snake, big worm, looked like a bunch of was it spiders that having a meeting on his head?
Oh man, I gotta rewatch that.
That's the superego just barging in like that, demanding, prohibiting.
All right, so it's not all right. Debo is more, maybe Debo's id.
Yeah, definitely. Because like he's just like, getting what he wants. Like there's no like prohibition on it. He might be a perverse subject. He might embody the law.
Need some working through.
Yeah. Psychoanalytic critique on Friday.
Forthcoming. So I'm gonna read what he says here that's really interesting because he parts ways with Freud when it comes to the superego. I think he has a very, very different conception of the superego because he doesn't see it as moralizing so much, but he sees it as an agency which splits the subject symbolic world, cuts it into one accessible part, which is recognized, and one inaccessible, forbidden part. It is this idea that we rediscover hardly transformed with almost the same emphasis in the register of the superego.
And one thing about the superego too is that like it's tyrannical, infantile simultaneously, and you brought up that the whole schism and the split. Even something in a symbolic order where the superego has this agency, it always leaves room for rebellion and transgression, but never to destroy it, but always to reintegrate it in some new form or fashion through transgressions.
Right. So what's interesting about that is almost it's like as if it were to incite the subject towards transgressing and then excoriate them for the transgression. It says one thing out from one side of its mouth and something out of the other side of its mouth, but it is not, as according to Lacan, exactly as Freud sees it. He says he gets carried away as like one of these toxic products which would release other toxic substances. Because I know, especially in uh, civilization, its discontents, and here he says also in Das Ich und das Es, that Freud talks about how the superego tends to intensify its demands and its imperiousness the more the subject actually approximates its dictates, and the pressure is exacerbated in proportion, as if to like constantly punish the subject. But Lacan says that doesn't quite tell the entire story.
It doesn't.
Because Freud, with his limited, not, I mean, can't call him limited, but like not having been exposed to structural linguistics, which wasn't around at the time, didn't have this notion of a symbolic system. So he's trying to locate the superego within the symbolic system, within the system of signifiers. And right, so he says that it's an analogous schism to what we find with the unconscious itself. Maybe it runs along the same sort of fault line of the unconscious in a certain sense. And it's like, this is where it gets complicated. So first, like, we should take a look at language and what we were saying before, that it's a universal symbolic system, but of course it does not belong to the subject, and that the subject is beholden to beholden to language, not the other way around. You can't just decide words mean what you want them to mean, despite the world we live in today where people do think they can do that. But how would you relate that to the superego, you think?
As far as language, universal language is concerned,
or better yet, like,
symbolic.
If the superego is the schism as it occurs for the subject in his relations with what we call the law, and then the unconscious is a schism of the symbolic system that causes kind of alienation. How can we connect those two exactly?
Yeah, so like, so far as like one, the unconscious, as is dealt with psychoanalysis, is always going to be something that has repressive mechanisms, in its structure, like a language, desire. Also, that this alienation that was just mentioned cannot exist without admission into the symbolic. So there's obviously the lure for the primary narcissism, but that's only just so much on this imaginary plane. But it isn't until the admission into the symbolic order where alienation differs us from in the animal kingdom, and that the alienation furthers the contradictions. And with that being said, the schism of the superego functions in the way it's like, one, we're split, being pulled out of ourselves by the law and its demands based upon prohibition and what's enjoyable, but then also the dependency of trying to develop this individual meaning of what we would be like outside of the law or separate from the law. Like, we believe that there's this us that is presupposed prior to this symbolic order. But you can't symbolize that without the symbolic order, which is kind of ironic too.
So it's a double bind
Yeah.
here that we're dealing with the symbolic and the superego. So law and language, it's like because, as we mentioned before, we are beholden to language because we are sorry for my bad French, but par lettre, the creatures that speaking beings. We must obey the law of language. It's a symbolic system. So inherent to language is the way language works, what words mean. And we know that words don't mean anything in any fixed sense, but syntax is something, this is how I'm interpreting it, and I could be wrong here, but syntax is commensurate with the law as it's laid out. And we're not just talking about like a jurisprudential sense of the law, but the law, as it is entwined with language itself, syntax, grammar, and defining ourselves. And the I also kind of plays into this, and that's like the purely self-reflective pillar of the law and of language. And these are two, in some ways, two different conceptions of the subject that, remember, we're always dealing with things breaking down with Lacan. So he's not trying to build us up to a kind of Heideggerian authenticity, but if it's like the law, the subject of the law and the subject of language, in some sense, they're not the same thing. In some sense, they are the same thing. And they do overlap, but they cannot be compatible and synthesized perfectly. And this is part of the struggle with, of course, how he's going to go into Oedipus here. Of course, Oedipus is going to determine the specific stature, posture, disposition that the subject has in regards to the law. But
yes,
I think I'm sorry that, like, I feel like I'm just
no
a hodgepodge of like a lot of different ideas, but I'm trying
no,
to
it actually makes a lot of sense. I think it's important that you do that because it's making me think of like how to tie this together. Freaking Dangerous Maybe's video on Oedipus Complex is fire, where he talks about
gotta rewatch that.
The Oedipus Complex and the rivalry between the child and the father is an imaginary relationship. However, there is the symbolic father that, if I'm not mistaken, is supposed to be the law, right? Because there's three fathers. There's the real father, the imaginary father, and the symbolic father.
Right. And they are irreconcilable ultimately. And this is the tension of the family drama, is in that irreconcilability. And of course, this reminds me of Anti-Oedipus here, in that, maybe they get something wrong in that they seem to be pointing out these incompatibilities as weak points within the Oedipus complex, but it's like the failure of the Oedipus complex itself which defines it, and which like leaves us with a kind of residual confusion which doesn't allow for any kind of perfect integration into the symbolic order. So again, it's a malfunctioning words, and everyone's specific malfunctioning is a kind of neurosis. Now, that wasn't a very good reading of D&G there, because it's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but in the sense that it's like, their criticism of Freud is that he would want to, in a sense, like neuroticize everybody. Debatable, but all of this does sort of ultimately
it makes me think of that post you tagged me in about that dude trying to defend Jung, and he's like, this is why like Bachelard, Gilbert Simondon and D&G took Jung, because Jung was ahead of his time. It's like Jung is literally bastardizing Oedipus complex with this anima and anima image.
Right. And I
Yeah.
guess it's like for D&J, it's like the predominance of the Oedipus complex as one of this is what I wanted to point out before, what you just mentioned, Andrew, that was like really, really good. The difference, like the idea that, the Oedipus complex is this sort of way station between the imaginary and the symbolic, and it has to perform two functions at the same time, which is like
Mhm.
structuration symbolically, but also imaginary rivalry. And I think they see that as as a problem.
Mhm.
But well, what are your thoughts on that? I don't know.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think like there is some value into anti-Oedipus, but I think really overall, so long as capitalism still exists, Oedipus exists. You know, I think there is a structural mechanism to it. I don't think that it's purely genealogical to just a historical thing. I mean, there are like with their criticisms, what it helped do is just bring forth more critical analysis on the concepts in psychoanalysis by psychoanalytic thinkers. Um, there's one book I'm reading like right now. Like I haven't really gotten too deep into it, but it's called like the. I think I showed it to you like in the last session. It was like the Oedipus Complex. It's a debate between psychoanalysis and anthropology, and kind of showing like, in a sense, there is some type of universality to the Oedipus complex.
Right, which can be figured in many different forms. I think it's
Yeah.
like for D&G, it's the fixation of the Oedipus complex in that kind of Trinitarian formation
Yeah.
as a triangle in the which leads to a kind of Christo-fascism is the term that everyone
Yeah.
post Roe versus Wade, but like a latent kind of Christo-fascism or Genesis that exists within that triangle. But the idea that Oedipus is also twofold, though, in terms of imaginary and symbolic, is it is difficult to grasp. But I think it's like it goes back to, I'm gonna try to say this, type
The troglodyte.
the Noctraglicite, the retroactivity of it, where it's like, well, the imaginary can only be imagined via the symbolic. So that's why to me, Oedipus is like this kind of Ouroboros or something. It's like it's
Yeah.
not like, oh, it just flips over suddenly into this structural symbolic reality, but it's also kind of structures retroactively the imaginary. And that's why it's difficult to understand the Oedipus complex in its like twofold functioning, because it
Yeah.
gives meaning to the imaginary after the fact, après coup. So a lot there, way too
Mhm.
much to
But yeah, then he brings up the fact of like
really
one of his
cover. But this is really
patients.
interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting that we have Lacan finally talking about one of his patients,
Yeah.
and this is, I guess, it becomes a very sort of like iconic example of how the symbolic operates, how it's supposed to be sort of like distilled from
Yeah.
the imaginary relations. And it's
Yeah.
like he has this patient who has issues with his hand, and like everyone in very textbook fashion relates it back to infantile masturbation. And he's like, but let's look a little bit further, let's ask him some more questions and see, like, where he comes from. Like, these are kind of simple questions in a sense, they don't have to be super complicated. It's just kind of like, well, they're his own cultural religious determinants coming from Islam, and his own relation to those very determinants becomes important.
Yeah. And in this sense, it's like this shows the symbolic father, which is, the God of Islam, taking hold on him, not his um real father or the father in the imaginary realm that he has a rivalry with, but rather the abstract tyrannical law, which in this case is symbolized as God for him.
which is the Quranic law, which he has an aversion to. So this is not a religious man, but what Lacan is revealing that's really interesting is just because someone may have disavowed or denied a religion or their cultural upbringing, it doesn't mean that that cultural upbringing is finished with them.
Exactly, and this is something that Nietzsche brings up with the God is dead thing, and overall his criticisms of philosophy, that even Enlightenment philosophy, even though they want to disavow religious superstition and theology, philosophy of the past, they are still doing the same thing with religion. Instead of talking about a true world, they're talking about utopians. They're talking about the rational animal, and, this abstract image. So it's very much very parallel.
And what's fascinating is then we also have méconnaissance, we have a misrecognition of the law that really does bring misrecognition into focus in a sense, because it's also something to me, hearing this and the fact that it affects him physically, in that, and I should explain what the exact context is here in greater detail, but the idea that it's almost like a misintegration of something, and that we get a somatic kind of manifestation of something that isn't quite integrated into the subject's consciousness. And that is that we should mention that, like, in Quranic law, a thief meant to have their hand cut off if they're caught, and that his father had got caught up in a scandal, and he was told his father was a thief and therefore must have his hand cut off. So now hand becomes this choice signifier.
It's like almost like a castration, the fear of castration.
Related to the fear of castration.
Seems, yeah.
And there's something here that he can't face head on, and instead it's his actual hand that does the work of metaphorizing.
Yeah. Yes.
Méconnaissance. This misrecognition. The question becomes, how do you reintegrate something like that back into the symbolic universe of patient
and
lodged in his symptoms?
Yeah, and this is the end of all, like, we're pretty much like towards the end. So like, I think this, if I'm not mistaken, becomes the open end of the this lecture, is the how do you integrate that.
Right, that is how he ends it, pretty much, right? After this, return to the superego, this blind repetitive agency. And I really like the way he defines it here, which is that it really reduces the law down to a point with an inadmissible, unintegrable, weird word, unintegrable character, a blind repetitive agency. So it's like what the superego is telling you to do is something extra symbolic, in that it can't really be articulate. It's inarticulate.
Yeah.
It's repetitive, and it's loud, and it's persistent, but what it's telling you to do can never really be discerned, I feel like.
Yeah, like it can't discern itself.
It can't discern itself, right?
Yeah.
Because it is only the manifestation of the schism within the law. And then superego is hugely important for Zizek in this sense, because for him, the law is something that can never ultimately justify the grounds from which it is pronounced. It is imposed upon others, or it wouldn't even be the law. So it's like there's no metalinguistic position for the law
Yeah,
itself.
its fragility gives it, the hand to like be able to like define itself. I mean, in a sense, it seems like the superego is like the epitome of like slave morality in the symbolic sense. Like for Nietzsche's like slave morality, like it is tyrannical, it's demanding, and at the same time, it could be infantile, it could be shameful, and even ridicule itself. I mean, it doesn't like no one doesn't have to look hard to look at how like the PMC are today, and like neoliberalism. It's like people will cancel themselves and then like ask for an apology by making like a TikTok or a bunch of tweets, not even for a specific set of people, but just like for the recognition of the big other to get admitted back.
Right. Or I saw
Yeah.
something recently like this guy who made a really terrible parody song about how he wanted to get canceled to get on, like to become famous.
Yeah, and it's like getting canceled, right? Makes you famous now. Like instead of being famous, like another way, it's like being famous for being canceled, not because you did something like that was horrendous or anything, but just the fact that like the signification of being canceled now.
Right, right, exactly. The signification of being canceled is a way of establishing yourself, and that's like trying. So it's kind of like trying to discern what the law wants of you is always
Yeah.
impossible.
And in a sense, it's like symbolic sadomasochism, or like by being canceled, like the enjoyment of being like having your image hurt, then brings your status up.
Right, right. The sadomasochism is
Yeah.
at the heart of it. That's what an adherence to the superego as the source of one's own subjectivation results in ultimately is this constant kind of tug of war almost. This is what Zizek advocates through his philosophy, trying to like distance yourself from is your own like jouissance is inescapable, but like your jouissance being too tied up with taking literally what can't be taken literal, which is the pronouncements of the superego,
Yes.
essentially. But yeah, I'm gonna lose my voice soon. So yeah, so we have the Oedipus complex again. It, it's really tough to tie all of this together at this point, but the different languages of a civilization gain in complexity. How does one make sense of this babble? And at this intersection, that's the word he's using here, a minimum requirement, uniform point, the language and law intersect within the Oedipus complex, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, definitely. And that's like what I was saying. It's like the difference between the real symbolic and the imaginary father.
Right. So the Oedipus is impossible ultimately.
Yeah.
And this is where D&G are probably right, because then we get these like strange displacements, or as Lacan's putting it here, like antinomic realities that bookend someone's symbolic world, and the many contradictions that are just part and parcel of being a subject of capitalism.
I would say these antinomic like ways are in a sense like the transgressions as well, because it's like antinomos is going against the order, right? Nomos meaning order and law, so antinomian is like in a sense going against, but like in a way that the symbolic and the superego fragility allows for those instances, but then it reintegrates it in like in a new way. Like in a sense, for an example, like I think I said this before, it's like, right, cops are supposed to uphold the law, right? But then like, they arrest some drug dealer and then they feel like a little transgressive. So they're like, yeah, let's snort some of this coke and like, go crazy. I mean, like look at Superbad, right? they were being transgressive. The cops with the way they took McLovin and they were like took him to a bar. You know, they're doing all this crazy shit.
And we as a society, generally speaking, it's like people like to know that cops are being transgressive to a certain degree. Remember when Trump said, like, oh, he was talking to some cops and he was like, oh yeah, like, well, you know, when you apprehend these bad guys, like, don't worry about their fragile heads once you've kind of taken them into the police van, like basically saying like, you know, hit their heads against the wall. It's like kind of, that is outside of the law. That is in itself transgression, but it's like an extra application. It's like but it also takes the guise of like a you know, overstatement of the law, right? Where it's like, and then it reminds me of something else that like a similar logic to, and I believe Dick Cheney said this directly. It's in that movie Vice, which is really good, where he says, you know, if, well, like, aren't these methods we're using to interrogate prisoners torture? They go against the Geneva Convention. And he's like, well, America doesn't torture people, therefore this isn't torture because America doesn't do it. You know what I mean? So it's like that right there is the tautological encapsulation of everything we're talking about, where it's like, it doesn't take a genius to see what's wrong with that statement, but it's always like something that's kind of logically in excess of, you know, what we take it as normally. And we like that. Not, I don't like it, but it's like,
but it's like
people enjoy that. They enjoy that absurd, like, redundancy at the heart of the law. There's enjoyment there
because it's closed. It doesn't leave openness.
Exactly, and that's what people crave many times. They're like, that's kind of to me, the conservative mentality. It's just kind of like that closedness,
and that's part of the symptom. The symptom tries to be tautological, it seems like,
right? Like self-justifying, self-spoken almost. All right, I think we cracked it. And I know there's some like little details here that are dribbling away from us, but I think our powers are flagging. And if we didn't cover something, then read it yourself. All right.
Exactly. That's
do everything.
We're helping you understand it, but you got to read it.
Tell us why we're wrong about everything. We're not.
We're not trying to be masters or subjects supposed to know.
We're remixing all this shit.
Exactly.
Although I do want to I like this last section here. It makes me think of, again, everything that we like to rail against. I get a little jouissance every time. I feel like Lacan is backing up our general distaste for ego psychology, but he says, you know, people don't tend to, in our world, want to talk about these grand ideas like justice and courage, and don't want to engage in these dialogues, everything that philosophy tries to explore. And he says they prefer to resolve things in terms of conduct, of adaptation, of group morale, and other twaddle. Does that remind you of anything that you experience on a daily basis, Andrew?
Oh yeah, it's literally like everybody, like, I'm not really political, like, you know, I don't like to talk about politics, but then at the end of the day, like, everything they do is the opposite of what they believe, you know. Or like this whole thing of just like like, oh, we just need to be like in the center about it. We just gotta like look at everybody's ideas and come to terms with the opposing groups. Just gotta adapt and overcome.
The illusion of an apolitical form of adaptation that can come with just seeing people as they are in themselves, and having a meaningful, productive dialogue that's gonna solve all our problems.
Everything outside of the master signifier, like, if that's a thing.
We just need to talk in mud and just sit down and have a good conversation.
I need a beer after that.
Amen.